We are tonight in Genesis 40, and we're in the last section of Genesis. The rest of the book will be the story of Joseph. It's not going to go back and forth between Joseph and any other major characters. 37 was the last, or 38 was the last chapter that does that, but now it's Joseph's story. Last week we saw the part of Joseph's story where he is in the service of Potiphar, and God blesses everything that he does in Potiphar's household. Potiphar gives him he puts under his control everything in his house except one thing, and that is his wife. And of course she makes the offer to him to lie with her. He refuses. She persists and does this day by day. And Joseph's character is absolutely sterling. He does not compromise until finally she tries to seduce him. He runs out. She grabs his cloak, his robe, and lies on him, says that he tried to rape her. So the chapter ended with him being thrown in prison, and yet in prison we saw that even there God blesses him. He's put in a place of authority, as sort of a trustee, even within the prison. And we saw so that the ending part of Genesis 39 mirrored the first part about the blessing of God upon Joseph, first in Potiphar's house, now in the prison. Now, chapter 40 begins, now there's more of an action that picks up with what happens in the prison. So let's read this beginning in verse 1. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So here's our two people in these would have been considered, to us it sort of sounds like these are menial servants, a cupbearer and a baker. But they're not. They're highly trusted officials. Why? Because they control what the king eats. And in the ancient world, even in the not so ancient world, like in British history, there's an awful lot of murder that goes on in the history of royal lines, especially from relatives. So if someone else is like next in line to the throne, they often want to knock off the guy who's the king, or in this case the pharaoh. And an easy way to do it is poison. So a cupbearer and a baker have access to the intimate life of the pharaoh. They control what goes into his body. They have to be very, very trusted servants, and they have to be responsible for the decorum, the protocol, a lot of things. So they're very high officials. We're not told in the text what they do that ticks him off. The fact that it happens to both of them might speak to the volatility of Pharaoh's personality. We don't know, but he puts them in prison. And even though they're in prison, they still get special treatment. Notice that Joseph attends to them, right? The captain of the guard appointed Joseph, it says in the ESV, to be with them. In Robert Alter's translation, he says to serve them. This indicates that he attends to them, that even though he's sort of in charge of things, these are high-profile prisoners, and because Pharaoh is a little volatile, I think everybody assumes they could go back into their old roles. So you don't just treat them like regular prisoners, they get special treatment. And Joseph is the guy that's in charge of it to make sure that they're taken care of in case they ever find themselves back in Pharaoh's court. Verse 5 says, one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each with its own. Now the ESV says interpretation, and most translations say interpretation, but I will tell you a better word here, a better translation is the word solution, because what this really means, when we say the word interpretation, we sort of think loosely. People go, oh, well, that's your interpretation, this is my interpretation. What's in view here is that there's just one meaning of these dreams. And so it's like a puzzle. What does the dream mean? Joseph has not just an interpretation, he has the solution. And they're looking for a solution. There's one conclusive decoding for every dream here in Genesis. Now, remember, we saw this at the beginning of the Joseph narrative. The Joseph story begins with Joseph having two dreams. One about the earth, and one about the sky, remember? And we're going to see this happen here in this chapter as well with Pharaoh's dreams. But so these guys, they each have a dream, but there's only one solution. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw they were troubled. Now, literally, this is a word in Hebrew for it means both sort of what their inward mood, or it can mean their outward appearance, like frowning. So he saw that they were frowning. So they had a dark mood that's clearly showing on their face. And he sees the frown on their face. He sees the trouble on their face that indicates something's going on down deep. And he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house. By the way, again, notice the use of the word house. This word house, he was in Potiphar's house, then he's in the prison house, and here it's called his master's house. Why are your faces downcast today? They said to him, we have had dreams, and there is no one to solve them. They need the solution. Joseph said to them, do not solutions belong to God? Please tell them to me. Now, this is really interesting because Joseph uses the word Elohim, which is the generic word for God. He does not use Yahweh's name. That probably wouldn't mean anything to these Egyptian guys. They wouldn't know who Yahweh is. He uses the generic word for God that to them, by the way, that name Elohim is plural. Remember in Genesis 1, we talked about that. In the beginning, God, plural, created, singular, the heavens and the earth. And you've got that plural name for God. So to these Egyptians, this is a generic name for God that could even mean gods to them. And Joseph throws this out there. They can hear it the way they hear it, but he's not tipping his hand, but he clearly says, look, God's the one who has the solution. What's fascinating is that Joseph, he trusts his ability to get this solution from God right from the very beginning. There's no hesitation. He's confident God will give him the solution. So he says, aren't solutions from God? So tell me your dream. Please tell them to me. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Now, I don't know that I would ever venture to interpret somebody's dream like Joseph does, but I will also say once we hear Joseph's interpretation, we look at his dream and go, oh, that makes perfect sense. It's not like this is a strange thing. Joseph hears it and he says, this is its solution. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. Now notice that phrase. We see this phrase in the Psalm that God is the lifter of our heads. What does that mean? Well, if you picture yourself in the presence of a king, you're doing obeisance, your head is bowed. I'm not worthy to be in your presence. And for a king to lift your head is for him to say, you can look at me. And he's granting you grace. And so Joseph uses this phrase that in 3 days, he's going to lift up your head. He's going to show you grace and restore you back into your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. So Joseph, he's got the solution. He gives it to him. But now look what he does. Already he's looking to the future. He's planting seed that will get him out. Only remember me. Now this word remember is an interesting word. It means mention me. Mention me. We have, in English, we even have this use of the word remember. I know it from, are you going, Scarborough Fair, Simon and Garfunkel? Remember me to one who lives there, right? Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Remember me to one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine. What's that mean? Mention me. Mention me. You have that same usage of the word remember in Portuguese. I know it. Remember me to her. Mention me to somebody. And this is exactly what Joseph is saying. He's not just saying remember me. He's saying mention me. When you get there, when you're back in Pharaoh's graces, mention me to him and get me out of here. Mention me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into, look at this word, the pit. The pit. Now what is the author doing here? He's calling the prison that Joseph is in a pit. How did this whole story start? His brothers throw him into the pit. And so the author's connecting where Joseph is now with where he started. His brothers threw him into the pit. He didn't do anything to deserve that. He didn't do anything to deserve this. He's still in the pit. And the story of Joseph is the story of God getting Joseph out of the pit. And you have that use of the word here. So he says, I haven't done anything that they should put me into the pit. I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. I've done nothing. And so when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. Now, I've just got to point out there's a little dark humor here. You're going to see it twice. Right here it is. We have the baker hearing Joseph's favorable solution to his partner's dream. And so you see his hopes get raised. Oh, this is a good thing. Uh, Tell me my dream too. And he's sort of thinking that he's going to get a good interpretation, a good solution as well. And he said, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. So you got a strange picture. By the way, again, like Joseph's first dream, the dream that Joseph had, we're beginning, remember, with the sheaves bowing down to him. That's a dream about the land. And then the sun, the moon, and the stars bowing to him, about the sky. Here you've got the cupbearer. His dream is about a product of the land. And then the baker, you've got these 3 things going up into the air. And birds of the air come and they're eating. It's a weird picture. He's balancing like 3 baskets of bread on his head. And then here's this ominous sign of birds eating out of it. That's disturbing. You don't want to think about birds eating your food or eating anything off your head. And he says, what does this mean? And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. Now listen to this. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you. Little dark humor there. Joseph, the way it's described here, it sounds like he's saying the same thing to him that he said to the cupbearer, but there's a little bit added to it, and that is he's going to lift up his head from off your shoulders. He's going to lift up your head from you. And then it says, hang you on a tree. But we have no evidence whatsoever of Egyptians ever hanging anybody. And I really defer to Robert Alter's linguistic expertise here. He says this means impale. So basically, Joseph says they're going to cut your head off and then impale your body on a stake. And like that's the kind of hanging that's in view. It's a very shameful thing. Anytime you don't bury somebody and you expose their body after death, that's a shameful thing. They did it in England. They're at the Tower of London. They put their heads on a pike. And this is a way to show someone was a traitor. And he says that's what Pharaoh's going to do. He's going to lift your head from you, and he's going to impale your body on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Wow, that must have been a strange 3 days for these guys. One of them anxious for it to pass and be restored, and the other guy hoping that Joseph doesn't know what he's talking about. But on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. All right, so he in essence, he brings them out of prison to his presence, and they don't know what's going to happen. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So he's restored to his former position, and he's once again serving Pharaoh his cup. But he impaled the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. Literally, it says in Hebrew, he did not remember Joseph. No, he forgot him. And here Joseph has been faithful to give the solution. He said, remember me, mention me, and nothing happens. And then verse 1 of chapter 41 begins, and 2 years of days. Now, it's an odd expression, isn't it? 2 years of days, but I think the ESV gets this right. 2 whole years. So 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. Now, I think this might be the only time I've ever heard cows described as attractive. But these were attractive cows. They're beautiful cows, and they are plump and by the Nile. By the way, you have a lot of borrowed words from Egyptian in this chapter. Mostly the titles, like Pharaoh, that's specifically an Egyptian word. The Nile, the name for the Nile, is an Egyptian word, and then some of the officials that are named here. So there's an authenticity to it that the author wants us to know. So he's by the Nile, not just by any river, but by the Nile, which is the river of Egypt, gives life to Egypt. They live based on that Nile. So Pharaoh has this dream by the Nile, and then Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk, and behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. So to the east of Egypt, of course, is the Sinai desert, and so when a wind comes off the Sinai, it's a hot, scorching wind. And this east wind blights the 7 ears, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled. Literally, it says his spirit was pounded. We think about your heart pounding and your spirit troubled, but literally this says his spirit was pounded. This was just beating on him. And he sent and he called for all the magicians of Egypt, these wise men sort of Egypt. They have to do with the Egyptian religion. And he called for them and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, and there was none who could solve it to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I recall my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own solution. A young Hebrew was there with us, a slave, and that's the word he uses, a slave of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dream. He solved our dreams to us, giving a solution to each man according to his dream. And as he solved it to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So he says, I recall that this happened 2 years ago. Remember when you put us in prison? We were there, and there was this Hebrew slave, and he interpreted our dreams. He solved our dreams, and maybe he can help you out. And this is here's Joseph's chance. Now, I sort of like to think about the 2 years between Joseph interpreting the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer and this moment when he's sent for by Pharaoh. It's sort of easy to imagine the hopelessness with which he could have seen that. And yet, everything in the text indicates to us that Joseph remains faithful, that he was as faithful under the waiting process as he was under the temptation of Potiphar's wife. that in both things he trusts the Lord. He does the right thing. He does not fail. He does not stop trusting God. He does not give in to temptation. He doesn't give in to depression. He's apparently still serving the captain of the guard here in the prison house. But now here comes his opportunity. So Pharaoh, in verse 9, let me scoot on down there. Verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of, here's that word again, the pit. Out of the pit. Boy, there's the phrase we've been looking for, right? He's thrown into the pit by his brothers. He's cast into the pit, the prison house by Potiphar, and he's languished there 2 years since he interpreted the dreams. Now, finally, they are, with all the waiting, now they're in a hurry to get him out of the pit. Now look at what Joseph does. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. Now that might sound like, well, of course he would. But if you look at all kinds of archaeological evidence from the ancient Near East, there's only one group of people who, at this point, who cut their hair short or even bald, and it's the Egyptians. And they rarely had beards. If they do, they've got those pointed ones you can see in all kinds of Egyptian artworks. The bas relief works there that they've discovered in Egypt. They shave their heads or they cut their hair real close. They don't have long hair. And Joseph is a Hebrew slave. He's in prison, but they tell him, we're going to take you before Pharaoh. What does he do? He shaves his head. In other words, he makes himself look like an Egyptian, so he won't seem strange to Pharaoh. Now, this doesn't really have a whole lot to do with this part of the story. It's going to have a lot to do with the story later when his brothers show up. But there's something here about Joseph's insight into how to be received by Pharaoh. Now, by the way, the law's not yet been given. The Hebrews have not been commanded not to cut their hair. That's just a tradition. The Egyptians, though, are different from all the Canaanite people, the African people. They cut their hair short or completely off, shave their heads, and they don't wear beards. So Joseph goes before Pharaoh. He's going to look like an Egyptian. He changes his clothes. I'm sure they give him clothes, apparel that would be appropriate for his audience with Pharaoh, and he's looking like an Egyptian. And verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, and here he tells him, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can solve it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can solve it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it's not in me. Elohim, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Joseph here does two things. First of all, he makes it clear that he's not the one who does this of his own power. He doesn't claim to be a magician like Pharaoh's magicians or a wise man. He says, it's not in me, it's God. But he also uses the generic name for God, Elohim. So again, this doesn't sound particularly strange to Pharaoh. Pharaoh probably not have ever heard of Yahweh. He just uses the generic word for God. And he says, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them. In Hebrew, literally, this says gaunt and very foul-featured and meager in flesh. Yeah, I had never seen the like in all the land of Egypt. He said, I've never seen cows this ugly, this terrifying. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly, as gaunt, as at the beginning. Now, this is sort of fascinating. This dream is a terrifying thing to Pharaoh. He calls them meager in flesh, or it comes from the Hebrew word dakot, which means hollow. They're hollow. And these cows are so terrifying that they're carnivores. They eat other cows. They're cannibalistic carnivores. They don't just, how many cows do you know that eat hamburgers? But these cows do. And he's never seen anything like this. Ugly cows that eat other cows, but even when they eat the fat cows, they don't grow any. They're still as ugly and gaunt as they can be. And he said, then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, and none could tell me the meaning. None could tell me. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. You know how in Luke, I pointed out, Luke says Jesus told them, so he told them this parable, and then there are 3 stories. 3 stories, 1 parable. Here, this is exactly what Joseph says. He says, this is one dream. The dream is one. So you didn't have 2 dreams, you had 1 dream, because they both mean exactly the same thing. God, Elohim, has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. What God is about to do, he's shown Pharaoh. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. The 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, this is what all of the dreams you have here in the Joseph narrative are all predictive. They don't just have meaning, they have meaning about the future. Joseph's 2 dreams at the beginning are about his future. The cupbearer and the baker, they have dreams about their future. And now Pharaoh, you see the doubling, and they happen in 2s. They're all predictive. And Joseph has, Joseph's interpretation of his dreams at the beginning of the narrative are implied. And everybody gets it. They're so clear, even his father gets it. He knows what he's saying. He rebukes him for it. And here, Joseph gets the meaning about this as well. And he says, God has shown Pharaoh what he's going to do. Verse 29, there will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So Joseph not only interprets the dream, he says the fact that God gave it to you twice means this is fixed. There are times in the Bible where God reveals something that could happen in the future, and people adjust to what God says, and the thing doesn't come to pass, right? Jonah, God says, I'm going to destroy Nineveh. They repent, God doesn't destroy Nineveh. David says to God, one time when he's hiding in a little village called Keilah, and he hears Saul and his armies coming for him, he says, will they give me up? God says, they're going to give you up. So David leaves, and they don't give him up, and Saul doesn't capture him. So sometimes God tells us what might happen so that we might make adjustments. Here, God tells what's going to happen, and there's no adjustment to be made. He says this is fixed. The fact that he told this to you twice is evidence that it's going to happen. God will bring it about. Now look at this. This is the end of the interpretation. Joseph's done with the interpretation. But look what an opportunist he is. And I mean that in the best sense of the word. He sees here that Pharaoh is positively disposed toward him. He's got Pharaoh's attention. Pharaoh is amazed at his ability to solve these dreams. Pharaoh sees wisdom in him. Now he's going to suggest something to Pharaoh. He's going to do it obliquely enough that it doesn't seem presumptuous. He's not going to say, why don't you appoint me? He's going to say, why don't you need to appoint a man? Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Now notice, Pharaoh consulted his wise men and asked them the meaning of the dream, and they couldn't tell him. You think he's going to choose one of his wise men? He is not. He's going to choose the one wise man who could tell him what the dream meant. And so Joseph is really smart the way he does this. He says, set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land. This phrase 1/5, I mean, it's sort of unclear. It might mean 1/5. That's probably the meaning, but he's clearly telling Pharaoh, you need to collect from the produce that is produced by the land during the 7 full years, and store it, and then during the 7 lean years you can keep your people alive. Verse 35, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. Let me go back to verse 34, where it says, let Pharaoh proceed to appoint. Literally it says, let Pharaoh muster the land of Egypt. He uses a military term here, like a general mustering the men, to assemble for battle. And this is Joseph using a term like to put Egypt on war footing. You need to command, you need to muster all the resources of Egypt in this effort in order to make this happen. And let them gather the food, verse 35, all the food of these good years that are coming up, and store grain literally under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So Joseph, man, he's got a plan. And this, of course, sounds great to Pharaoh. Look at Pharaoh's response. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Now, I don't think, this is one of those places in the Bible where you've got somebody saying something that is more profound than they even know. In the New Testament, in the Gospels, when Caiaphas says of Jesus, well, it's right that one man should die for all the people. And it says, he said this because he was the high priest. He didn't understand that what he was saying was an inspired utterance. He meant it a completely different way, but God had another meaning, and this is true here of this Pharaoh. He uses the word Elohim, which can be plural. He can say, he is saying, hey, is there anybody that the spirit of the gods dwells in like this guy? But unknowingly to him, he's using a name for God, the one true God. And notice the ESV capitalizes the S, the Spirit of God, capital G. And I think that's right. I think they should do it. I don't think that's what Pharaoh meant, but I think it's what the Spirit of God meant and wanted us to see that God is at work unbeknownst to Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't understand that this is all a part of God's divine plan. But he's saying things beyond his ability to even comprehend. God is doing a work. This is exactly what God said he would do. Back in chapter 37, where we saw the dreams that Joseph had as a boy, now God's fulfilling them. God has taken him into the pit twice and brought him out. By the way, it should not be lost on us. We've seen Joseph lose his clothes twice, right? He got his coat of many colors taken from him and was used to deceive his father. Potiphar's wife takes his robe from him. Now, when he came out of the pit, he was given one set of clothes, right? And now he's about to be given another set because Pharaoh's going to really dress him up. He says, we can't find anybody in whom the Spirit of God is like this man. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there's none so discerning and wise as you are. And I'm sure Joseph looked absolutely shocked and surprised that Pharaoh would say this, but I think it's exactly what and I say plotted in the best possible sense, because I think God was the one who gave him the wisdom to do that. He said, you shall be over my house. Oh, look at this, man. He was over Potiphar's house. Then he was over the prison house. But now God's kept his word to him. He's going to be over Pharaoh's house. It should not be lost on us. In the book of Hebrews, it talks about Moses being faithful in all his house and comparing him to Jesus, our high priest, who is faithful in all his house. This is what a great mark of God's servants is, that they are faithful in what God puts under their hands. And so in the same way that Moses is faithful in his house, later after this, we see Joseph is faithful in every house God puts him in. The Potiphar's house, prison house, and now Pharaoh's house. Of course, ultimately pointing us to Jesus, who's faithful in all his house. He's faithful in bringing many sons to glory. And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land. Let me back up, verse 40. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. What did Joseph say? You need to muster the land of Egypt. And now building on that, Pharaoh says, okay, all my people are going to respond to your order. You're going to be the one to muster all of Egypt on my behalf. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. So this is just like Potiphar put everything under Joseph's hand except one thing, his wife. And now Pharaoh puts everything under Joseph's hand except one thing, the very throne itself. And Joseph is going to rule on his behalf. And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold, it says chain about his neck. And again, I think this means, you've probably seen those in Egyptian pictures of those bas-relief images. They would wear like a collar, a gold collar over their shoulders and came down like this. So it's more than a chain. It probably was some kind of braided gold. very heavy, very costly, but it clearly shows Joseph is the man. This thing would be so expensive and so much a symbol of authority that not anybody would have this but Pharaoh himself. And so here we have Joseph now. He's had his garments taken away twice. Now he's been given garments twice. Once to come out of the pit, and now to ascend to the rule of Egypt. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, Abrek. Now this is a weird word. Bow the knee is about as good a guess as any what it means. It comes from Egyptian, but it means something like make way. This is them announcing beforehand, hey, here comes Pharaoh's guy. Make way, bow the knee, give obeisance to him the same way you would to Pharaoh. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Boy, that's authority, isn't it? Anybody that raises their hand or takes a step, it's going to be because you gave the okay. Nobody can do anything outside of your power. So when this formula, I am Egypt, or I am Pharaoh rather, it's sort of what kings would do. I am Nebuchadnezzar, and I confer on you. And we would do it like under the authority vested in me as king and potentate. They say, I am Pharaoh, and I am giving you this power. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. So he gives him an Egyptian name. And this change to an Egyptian name is in the same way he gives him Egyptian clothes and the signet ring and the Egyptian collar. The name, we think, means God speaks, he lives. And a famous Egyptologist, Moshe Weinfeld, says that's what that means. I'm going to take his word for it. That sounds right to me. God speaks, he lives. And it makes sense that that's what Pharaoh would name him. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. On is not a god, it's the name of a place. So this priest was the priest in a town called On. Later, the Greeks named it Hierapolis, but it's a big city in Egypt. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Now look, God has, first of all, he has orchestrated events, that he has been faithful to Joseph. But remember Hebrews 11, that sometimes God doesn't keep his promise in our time. Hebrews 11, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them afar off. Well, Joseph didn't die before he got the promise, but 13 years. It's been 13 years since he was thrown into that pit by his brothers, that now he ascends to the throne of Egypt. God's been faithful in that, but the text wants us to know that Joseph has been faithful to God in this. And his faith has not shaken. When opportunity struck, he's taken it, and now he's ready to rule. God now has moved. He's orchestrated everything in place to get his people in line. Remember, God has already told Abraham that his descendants are going to be down in Egypt for 400 years. So God knows the end from the beginning. So God has already said this is going to happen, and yet here he is orchestrating in the most minute detail all of these circumstances in order to do exactly what he's promised, because he's going to have his people down in Egypt to deliver them up to the promised land in Exodus. It's all his grand scheme of redemption, that God is in charge of the big picture, but he is managing the most minute details down to the dreams of a pagan Pharaoh and what he says. So next week we'll pick up here where now Joseph is ruling, and during those 7 lean years, somebody's going to show up needing his help.